Welcome to this keynote session. I hope you're enjoying the summit so far. My name is Sanjay Parikh. I'm one of the co-founders of Indegene, and I'm really delighted and honored to be introducing our keynote speaker for this session, Troy Sarich, Chief Commercial Data Science Officer in the Global Commercial Strategy Organization, who is often referred to as GCSO, of Janssen Pharmaceuticals. In his role, Troy is responsible for accelerating the growth of industry-leading commercial data science, real-world evidence, and digital health capabilities for Janssen globally, and driving growth for the company's $48 billion worldwide commercial pharmaceutical business. He's also a member of the J&J Data Science Council, which he co-founded in 2018 to advance the utility and impact of data science across J&J. Over a career of more than 24 years in healthcare, 16 of which have been in J&J, Troy has worked across multiple therapy areas and across functions from R&D to commercial, including clinical research, data science, real-world evidence, medical devices, digital health, startup models, and major business transformations. Most recently, he was vice president and head the cross-sector programs in the Lung Cancer Initiative at J&J and served as chair of the J&J Lung Intervention Steering Team. Prior to this, as vice president and global head of Janssen's R&D strategy, he led multiple initiatives to transform R&D capabilities and shape the future pipeline of new medicines. He is a recipient of the prestigious Johnson Medal for being part of the team effort to bring Xarelto to millions of patients through one of the largest clinical development programs in industry history. Troy earned his bachelor's in pharmacology and therapeutics and his PhD in clinical pharmacology from the University of British Columbia. He has published more than 80 papers and abstracts during his career. So, we could go on and on about his achievements, but with that, let me hand over to Troy to talk to us about opportunities for the pharmaceutical industry from the digitization of healthcare. As always, please post your questions in the chat box, and I'll be happy to pose them to Troy after his presentation. Troy, welcome to the Indegene Digital Summit. The mic is all yours.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. I really appreciate that kind introduction. It's great to be here today, and I'm looking forward to sharing some perspectives on the digitization of healthcare and how the pharmaceutical industry can take advantage of that. So I'll jump right in and share my screen if that's okay. All right, here we go. We'll try again. So it's my pleasure today to present some thoughts on opportunities for the pharmaceutical industry from the digitization of healthcare. And of course, I need to show you my disclaimer slide right at the start. And I've decided to break this presentation into three parts: insights and evidence generation, digital clinical evidence, and the digital health boom. Now, clearly, the pharmaceutical industry is reinventing itself in the midst of a reinvention of our healthcare system. But the question I'd like us all to think about during this session is, will increased access to all this data lead to better insights and evidence? We know that there's a tremendous amount of data available, and it's increasing, I think, doubling every 70 days. Insights and evidence are being created at an ever-increasing rate. Artificial intelligence and machine learning is accelerating this. But the evidence quality of these outputs varies. And patients, providers, and payers want more information, but they also have less bandwidth. We're all inundated by emails and text messages and social media and notifications. So where is this all going? First, I want to cover say a few words about randomized controlled trials. We know they're the gold standard for evidence, but real-world evidence, data science, and digital health opportunities are expanding. However, RCTs are expensive, they're lengthy, they're complex, but they are still required for regulatory approval, mostly, and I'll come back to that. We also know RCTs can't answer all questions. But fortunately, there are new evidence opportunities all around, and the digitization of healthcare and the digitalization of society means that this change is accelerating. So to talk about RCTs for a moment, reproducing RCTs using real-world evidence is challenging. This study was just published in Circulation along with a very nice editorial talking about the attempted emulation of RCTs with real-world evidence. And what they concluded was that agreement between RCTs and real-world evidence depends on which agreement metric is used, and that more trial emulations are needed to understand how often and in what context RWE findings match RCTs. So what this really means is that in RCTs, we can collect specifically the data we want. In real-world evidence, we have to use what data is available. And if those don't match up perfectly, it's hard to emulate an RCT with real-world evidence. So the methodology is getting better and better to emulate, but the data matching is not quite there yet. Still, we see a lot of real-world evidence used for regulatory purposes, and it is increasing over time. But if you look at what's happening, the majority of the utilization of real-world data for regulatory purposes is in rare diseases. And it's not in mainstream areas where randomized controlled trials can be used. It's really in cases where randomized controlled trials can't be done, or it's really unethical to do. But still, that's okay. RCTs and real-world evidence go best together, I believe. I don't think our aspiration should be for RWE to replace RCTs. More and more over time, pre-launch and well post-launch into commercialization, real-world evidence is playing a bigger and bigger role in supporting our products in the marketplace. And that opportunity will continue to increase for a number of reasons. Number one, there's more and more data available all the time. But the data that's available from the healthcare system is not that easy to work with in its raw form. So there's a lot of work needed there's a lot of data engineering effort needed, in fact, to curate that data, to make it usable for analytics, to combine the data together, and ultimately to make it useful for generating insights and evidence. But this promising space now has attracted a ton of investment. This was an interesting analysis done by McKinsey. More usable data, more advanced approaches, and more computing power has led to a 5x increase in venture funding since 2015, 74 FDA-approved analytics applications, almost 50% average year-on-year increase in published research around artificial intelligence and machine learning. And importantly, computers have now surpassed humans in language understanding. Now, this is not just what we call natural language processing that's been around for many years. It's all the way to medical language processing, which is more complex. And so companies like OM1 have built an OM1 engine where they use machine learning to convert unstructured data into structured data. So it's research-ready, clinically meaningful data for use. And many companies are doing this, and the real value is not just that conversion, but the linkage of that structured data to other data sources from patients. So you have a continuous longitudinal journey for those patients over time to understand how their disease initiates, progresses, how they're treated, and what their outcomes are after treatment. But it's not just healthcare data that's expanding. There's omics that are being created, omics information being created from all over the medical and scientific infrastructure of the world. The biomedical literature itself is expanding at an increasing rate. And together with electronic medical records and all this information, we've long surpassed the ability for the human brain to manage all this information and make sense of it. So companies like Inference have built extremely powerful analytics engines that not only combine rich data from academic medical centers, like in their partnership with the Mayo Clinic, but combining those search engine capabilities together with biomedical literature, real-world evidence from outside that medical center, other omics data, and importantly, pharmaceutical companies, even internal information. So this kind of computing power is opening up all kinds of new insight generation for us. But there are situations around the world where medical systems have incredibly valuable data, but we can't get direct access to it. Today, we get direct access to de-identified information from many medical centers, but many medical centers won't let that information out for security and compliance reasons or laws. And so companies like Alkin have developed some really interesting technology called Federated Learning. So that on the left-hand side, in the traditional model, algorithms are developed by pooling data together and building the algorithms. In the federated learning model, they actually build those models within the healthcare systems. So these algorithms can actually be trained remotely, which preserves the security and privacy of distributed data, but allows us to get insights out of it without that information ever leaving the secure and compliant location that it's originally generated in. And then organizations like Odyssey have been working on this also for a number of years, and they've developed an international network of data, and they've curated it into a common data model, and they've got data from over 70 countries around the world. 330 databases have adopted the OMOP common data model, and they're approaching 1 billion unique patient records represented in this platform. So the power to generate insights here is phenomenal. Even within Europe, where Odyssey has partnered with Eden, they now have 98 data partners across 23 countries and 450 million patient records in the EU. For the reasons I just explained, this is what's driving deep learning models that is pushing healthcare forward. It's access to all this information that's allowing us to build models that are predictive, that create artificial intelligence, and are advancing healthcare. But we have to ask ourselves, how do we make sure out of all this opportunity to generate insights and evidence that it's actually impactful for us as a pharmaceutical industry? And also, when we're trying to generate this information and understand more about it and do studies, pre-marketing, post-marketing, how do we engage with patients on this journey? And when we want to communicate the information we generate, the insights and evidence, will we be effective at even getting our messages heard? And these are really important questions for us to figure out. So I want to move in for a few minutes here into digital clinical evidence. Now, we've been evolving our digital clinical evidence generation approaches over a number of years and through a series of step changes. And I'll use atrial fibrillation as a case study here. Atrial fibrillation, as you may know, is a leading risk factor of stroke. There's more than 3 million people today in the US with atrial fibrillation. This is an irregular rhythm of the heart, and it results in a 5 times greater stroke risk. And importantly, almost a third of patients are undiagnosed. So think about that. There's over 1 million people in the United States who have atrial fibrillation, who don't know it, who are walking around with a 5 times greater stroke risk. And that's one of the reasons why, sadly, every 40 seconds, someone has a stroke in the US. What's important to note here is that there are very effective therapies today to reduce the risk of stroke in patients who have atrial fibrillation, but you first have to diagnose it. And if you look over time, atrial fibrillation prevalence increases with age. So if you look at the United States alone, by 2050, there may be 12 to 16 million people in this country alone, not counting the rest of the world, who have atrial fibrillation and have this really elevated stroke risk. So a number of years ago, we partnered with Aetna and Scripps Research on a research study called mSTOPS, mHealth Screening to Prevent Strokes. And with Dr. Eric Topol and Dr. Steve Steinhubel, we designed a digital, pragmatic, direct-to-participant clinical trial for identifying undiagnosed atrial fibrillation in a large health plan population. And we enrolled over 2,000 members from the Aetna insurance network. We leveraged their claims data and used their analytics for recruitment and follow-up. And ultimately, we looked at whether it was possible to identify an at-risk population for asymptomatic AFib in this study, engage in at-home cardiac monitoring, and demonstrate clinical benefit in this population, and importantly, at low cost. So a few design principles that we incorporated to try to make this very easy for people to participate. Number one, make it as easy as possible. No geographic limitations to enrollment. 100% digital interactions with all participants as a primary focus. And all of a participant's information would be returned to them. So what we did essentially, starting on the left, we identified a number of Aetna members who, based on demographic and comorbid factors, looked like they were at an elevated risk of having atrial fibrillation. They were notified through the Aetna network. They were sent an email, and if they opened the email, they got information about the study. They saw videos from Eric Topol, and if they were interested to participate, they could consent in the trial online. And then if they agreed to be a part of the study, we would send them a Zio patch, a single lead ECG that they could wear for up to 2 weeks. They would remove it, send it back in the mail to iRhythm, who would do the analysis. And then the results would be sent back to Scripps Clinic for Dr. Steinhubel and his team to evaluate and notify participants if they had irregular cardiac rhythm abnormalities. So I want to talk a little bit about recruitment here, because this gets a lot into how we engage with patients without an investigator involved. So we had over 350,000 Aetna members who were eligible. We invited over 50,000 by email. Later, we also sent some direct mail postcards, but we had over 2,600 individuals consented and confirmed eligible for the study. What was interesting, though, was you can send out a lot of emails to get people's attention. It doesn't mean they'll open them. And so we incorporated some behavioral psychology type of A/B testing approach, where we tested different email subject lines to see what people would react to and open. And remember, in most clinical trials, there's an investigator sitting across from a patient, talking to them, answering their questions. This is merely an email in an inbox and no investigator interaction. So you need an additional level of kind of interest to pique in someone to open up their email and read it. So we tested different messages: way to control, please help us understand heart health. We used social proof approaches. We used an exclusivity approach to make you feel special to join a select group. We personalized the message, having someone's name added. And then we looked at the data, and we found that actually, when you use someone's specific name in a sentence, they have a higher likelihood to open that message. And then we tested a new batch of messages: an altruistic plea, you can help make a difference in medical care; new technology, we'd like you to test a new wearable device; personal health information, find out if you have atrial fibrillation, an unusual heart rhythm. Now, I'll pause for just a second and ask you to look through these and see which one you think would have the biggest impact with getting patients' attention and getting to open the email. Well, if you said new technology and test a new wearable device, you were right. we actually saw a 2 to 3-fold increase in the number of people who not only opened it, but then clicked through to learn more about the study. So technology actually is quite motivating for people. We went on to test this further by adding in the personalization of the message. And again, not only the open rate, the click rate, but the enroll rate, which ultimately matters. How many people enrolled? On the bottom right, new technology had about twice as much enrollment ultimately as the other messages. And so there's a theme here about blanketing an audience or blanketing a population with one message is not as effective as targeting messages to individuals. And I'm going to come back to that a couple times through the presentation. So ultimately, we went from our original email on the bottom left, where we had about a less than 1% enrollment rate. With testing, we pushed the percent enrollment rate up quite a lot. To the near halfway through recruitment, we got up to 9.3%, where we were enrolling people at a much higher rate than we started in the beginning, because we created a learning model where we could actually improve our messaging over time. And ultimately, it required repetition, so 3 emails and 2 direct mail pieces. And we also went to direct mail, partly because of the demographic here. There's an older population who we felt maybe won't be as interested or as comfortable as signing up for something over email or on the internet. And we saw that also boosted the enrollment significantly. Now, the good news out of the study is that we saw about a 3-fold increase in the detection of atrial fibrillation in these individuals versus an external control arm. And we shared this information, we published this information. And importantly, it's not just about detecting atrial fibrillation, it's seeing if you have a clinical impact that matters. So over a year, we actually saw an increase in cardiology outpatient visits, but importantly, a lower rate of emergency department visits and hospitalizations over the 1 year following screening. And the 3-year outcomes from this study are soon to be published. So right around the time that we published this work, Apple was working on updating their Apple Watch with ECG detection technology. And we met a few times over that period. And in the first quarter of 2020, we launched the Johnson & Johnson Apple collaboration on Heartline, which is a clinical study to determine if the Apple Watch and a heart rhythm and a heart health program can improve heart health outcomes. So this study is ongoing. It's, as I say, J&J in collaboration with Apple, inviting individuals 65 and over to join the study. You can sign up online, and essentially, it's fairly simple. You download the app, you read and follow the eligibility and informed consent information. If you agree, then you get into the app and data permissions. Then you get into your study group assignment. And you're assigned groups based on if you have atrial fibrillation or you don't, and also whether or not you own an Apple Watch. Now, one of the really interesting things about this study, and no surprise, Apple is pretty fantastic at technology. The app that was built and is now used by participants in the study is very interactive. We have high adherence to the app and to the study. And we are pushing out additional study activities to the study participants to learn things along the way. And about a year ago, before COVID vaccines were available, we had the question in society of vaccine hesitancy. So we were wondering, what were the factors driving vaccine hesitancy in preparation for the release of vaccines so we could learn from that? So we pushed out a study through this program, and to over 9,000 study participants, we had an 81.3% response rate, which is really very high. It shows high engagement with the app. And in this particular study, 91.3% reported a willingness to be vaccinated. So it's a pretty good number. 1 in 11 reported vaccine hesitancy or lack of willingness to receive the vaccine. But what we learned in this study, why that was, or what would change their mind, is education by health providers directed toward assuaging concerns about vaccine safety and efficacy could help improve their vaccine acceptance among those less willing. So it was a good learning for us. We were able to take, learn a lot of things about this study, vaccine hesitancy. Clearly, national vaccine hesitancy numbers are much higher here in the US than just 9%, but it speaks again to knowing your audience. And we write about this in the discussion of the manuscript, that this is an older population at risk of severe COVID-19 complications who have agreed to participate in the study and are comfortable with technology. So it's a subset of the US population. And so we need to be, when we do research, we need to know how generalizable it is. And true today, this is a special subset of the US population. So I've given a couple examples of how we've been working in the digital health boom, both with decentralized trials and new technology. And the entire field is really on an incredible growth phase. So CV Insights created this output on highlighting 150 companies in the digital health space, and they span topics from clinical intelligence and enablement, screening and diagnostics, virtual care delivery, disease management and therapeutics, and on. And from those 150 companies and more, it's very impressive. There's over 350,000 health apps in app stores. So as a pharmaceutical industry, when we talk about creating a health app, we're competing with 350,000 other ones. Now, this number does include health and fitness as well as medical apps, but you got to think, for the individual consumer, it's daunting to find their way through this array of options. And unfortunately, some things have come out of it that are not so good. This was an unfortunate story to read over the summer, where this physician, Dr. Long, had gone in for a biopsy, and she was waiting for her physician to inform her of her results of the biopsy. She got a notification in her patient chart app that she had been, that a message was available, and she went to the results section and found her diagnosis in the results section. And it was never communicated to her by her provider. Now, she wrote, yes, I'm a physician, but still, this is not the way we should be handling patient information and patient data or managing patients. So imagine this happening to one of your loved ones who's not a medical professional. This would be a devastating incident. And it's with that context that it's good to see the FDA has stepped in here, and they've created the Digital Health Center of Excellence. There needs to be some management of digital health technology so that we keep what's most important in mind at all times, and that is, what's the benefit of patients, and are patients protected through this? And some of the objectives of this Center of Excellence are to connect and build partnerships, to share knowledge, and to innovate regulatory approaches to working in this space. Now, one of the things that we struggle with as a pharmaceutical industry and as society is a question that we may have all faced with a visit to the doctor when they ask, have you been taking your medication? Have you been taking what I prescribed to you? The sad truth is that we're not very good. Culturally, or whatever it is, there's many, many reasons, but poor patient adherence is a big problem. And this is an opportunity for the pharmaceutical industry to leverage digital health to improve patient adherence. And it's a huge cost to the healthcare system. We've all seen reports of billions and billions of dollars lost through poor patient adherence to medications. And the data are just not getting better. If you look at this report from IQVIA, by 1 year, pretty much all categories of drugs here are below 50% remaining on therapy. And it's a really intractable problem to solve. So there's many reasons for this. It is a difficult challenge, but I'd say if there's one thing that all this data, all this understanding of patient behavior, and all this new technology can help us with, this has certainly got to be one of them. And in fact, we've been working on an app, a healthcare app, for a number of years that's incorporated behind many of our brands, an increasing number of our brands. And the technology's built. There's a number of trackers that we can use with this technology. And the team has done some really nice work looking at medication adherence and understanding patterns of adherence and patient behaviors. And so they looked at several hundred patients and patient adherence patterns, and using data science methods, they categorized adherence into 7 subgroups. And so each of these subgroups has an interesting pattern of how they behave. And this is exactly the type of problem that data science and predictive modeling can help us with. So if we could use data to develop predictive models to know ahead of time which individuals are going to fall into which category here, we could build solutions to ahead of time start to prevent these poor outcomes as far as adherence goes out of 6 of these 7 categories. And so that's exactly what the team has been working on, is figuring out an adaptive solution that can expand impact in this area. And it's really about behavior change, but data-driven behavior change, and figuring out which technique works for which subgroup. And there, that gets back to the same message around targeted messaging. It's like precision medicine and individualized messages that matter the most to get people's attention. So we're on this journey where we've flipped from the traditional HCP-centric model of the patient goes to care, and now care goes to the patient. And obviously, telemedicine is a big part of that. It's dramatically accelerated during COVID. But during these interactions, when a physician or healthcare provider tries to understand what's going on with a patient, and they're not in the same room, it's difficult in many cases to know. And that's why the field of digital biomarkers has been exploding. There are many, many sensors being developed today, off-the-body sensors, on-the-body sensors. It's an incredible opportunity for data collection, tracking, early diagnosis, medication, side effect or efficacy management, you name it, there's multiple opportunities here. And I think one of the examples that we learned about a few years ago that is still growing in utilization is out of Dina Katabi's lab at MIT. So not only do you not have to wear a medical device, a tracker, they've worked on technology called the Invisibles, where if you're in your own home, they've developed a wireless sensor with artificial intelligence that without you wearing any sensor at all, it can tell where you are in the house, if you're standing, sitting, lying down, if you've fallen, how much time you're spending in the kitchen, in the bathroom, in the bedroom, how fast you're walking, how slow you're walking. I even understand that it can track respiration and potentially even heart rate. Now, this is game-changing, not just for clinical development of new medical innovations, but post-marketing commercialization, tracking, and follow-up of how patients are doing on medications. So, wow, what a world we're living in. It's so exciting. And for the pharmaceutical industry, it's a huge opportunity for us to live into this and make sure that we evolve as fast as the healthcare system is around us. And in the last few thoughts here, I want to just point out back to the same message I was talking about earlier about messaging and signal to noise. This came out just the other day. Doctors are overwhelmed. They've got constant information flowing at them. We would like to be able to communicate to them as part of the pharmaceutical industry, and they have really limited bandwidth for us. And Swoop from Real Chemistry did a really nice white paper on this, and I know there's been a lot of talk about this already during the summit, but one of the phrases in here was so perfect. Blanketed targeting of HCPs is not correlated with meaningful engagement, which means value is wasted because brands can't maximize their returns. And if you categorize HCP influencer signals in different categories, they're seeing a $6.50 lift for every dollar spent on influencer marketing. And this all gets into targeted messaging. And of course, monitoring each channel's performance in isolation is the key to measurement of the actual effect you're having and knowing what works for the audience you're trying to communicate with. So we're moving at light speed. The question from the very beginning, I think the answer is yes. Increased access to data will lead to better insights and evidence. There will be a few bumps in the road, but if we act appropriately in the pharmaceutical industry, there's huge opportunity. In conclusion, randomized controlled trials rule, and real-world evidence will substantially amplify insights and evidence. They're not in competition, they're complementary. Data science is needed for increasingly complex data sources. Digital health impact is accelerating. The pharmaceutical industry has an important opportunity to drive positive change for patients and the entire healthcare system. And producing high quality insights and evidence and being able to effectively communicate it is the winning formula. So with that, thank you very much. Sanjay, I guess we'll hand it back over to you.
Wow, Troy, that was really fascinating. Thank you so much. This is an eye-opening presentation that have gone on and on. And actually, to be very honest, I had a whole bunch of questions that I was noting down, but I've been inundated with questions in the chat window itself. So I think just to be fair to the audience, what I'd like to do is kind of pose some of the questions here in no particular order, but let me just pick one of them. And you know, you talked a lot about how you and your team have actually worked on some of these apps and you know, have really been able to demonstrate some very spectacular results, or very interesting results and insights. The question that's come up in the chat window is, where do you see the trends when it comes to customer apps or digital health apps in future? Getting built in-house in pharma organizations or driven by tech giants? And if it is the tech giants, your Apples or the Googles, etc., what steps would pharma companies need to take to be equal partners and not just become vendor customers?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I know it's one that all companies right now are struggling with, or maybe not struggling with, but trying to figure out. You know, we at Johnson & Johnson, we consider ourselves a 135-year-old startup. And we have adopted technology, I think, at a very rapid rate. So I believe that at a company like ours, at large pharma companies in general, I think there is the potential to develop digital health technologies and own them as a pharmaceutical company. But I'm not convinced myself that that's always the right solution. So if we look at say the 150 companies that were out on the CV Insights chart, and that's just a slice of the companies that are working in this space. Pharmaceutical companies have built deep expertise in pharmaceutical agents. We're drug developers and commercializers. That's what we do. And I think that the technology world is moving so fast that we would probably be short-sighted to try to do it all on our own. You know, working with Apple has been eye-opening for us on the Heartline study. The level of technological experience and knowledge and understanding customers from a tech perspective is just something that I believe the pharma industry is going to take a while to catch up with. And we need to try to. But I think as fast as we run, tech companies are moving even faster. So I do think that partnerships are going to be the solution in the end.
Wonderful. And, given the last year and a half that we've gone through, you talked a little bit about some of the stuff that's happened around COVID. Questions are, if we take learnings from here and the rate at which technology is developing, question really is, what would be the key areas of improvement in our response to future pandemics with some of these tools? Better platforms for data analysis, better understanding of data compared to previous years and learning from previous pandemics. Are you seeing ways in which we can apply some of that through data science?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Hopefully there won't be a future pandemic, but we can only hope. But I think we should prepare. It's a good question. It's been remarkable as a kind of long-standing member of the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm sure many, all the folks on this call, and a proud moment for the pharmaceutical industry to have developed vaccines and medicines in record time. And what's been incredibly, I guess, frustrating for a lot of us has been the lack of uptake of them. And I think it comes back to it comes back a lot to behavioral psychology and communication and messaging. And I do think that there's an educational component, there's a communication component, a messaging component that maybe we partly underestimated, but also I think society as a whole has realized that that there needs to be really strong messaging and communication from authorities. It came out clearly in the survey we did and with the sub-study in Heartline that people who had vaccine hesitancy were the ones who were, they wanted to hear from a healthcare practitioner that it was okay. And if we can actually make that happen ahead of time while we're developing vaccines and drugs, hypothetically, for the next pandemic, maybe we can prepare the country and all around the world. Maybe we can prepare populations better for what's to come. Because it has been, I think, a surprise and a reactionary approach to try to convince people that vaccines are a good thing to take, for example, during a pandemic. So, those are just my personal thoughts. I'm sure we could have a fantastic discussion on this with the folks in the meeting, and much to talk about there.
And just, following up on that, you talked about, patients wanting to hear from their providers, and then you also, alluded to telemedicine and stuff. So one of the questions that's come up in the chat window is, do you see this trend of technology being driven engagement with patients, right? Whether it's from the provider or from the pharmaceutical company or other stakeholders in the industry, becoming a standard in the future. And I guess, personally, just when I think about it, will this become a new paradigm for being able to also provide much needed healthcare in areas which are underserviced, for want of a better word?
Yeah, I think there's no turning back, and I think it's a good thing. The access to technology is really around the world. Cell phones, smartphones are extremely prevalent. I think there's more cell phones on the planet than people, and I think we have to live into that. But it live into that opportunity. But I do think, back to signal to noise, we probably all got 200 apps on our phones, and we use maybe 10 of them. So there's a real component here of not just producing, not just creating, but planning what's the subsegment of the population you're trying to reach, what's the message that you want them to get, and how are you going to get to them? Because we know people just have limited time and limited bandwidth.
Sure. And if I were to kind of probe a little bit more as the person who's actually driving so much of the data science culture within J&J. This is a very interesting question. How can an organization determine whether they need more data or different sources of data, or do they need better solutions to analyze the data that they have?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I'm sure all companies are struggling with. It really comes back to, what did Einstein say? His famous quote: "If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd figure out the question to ask first, what the question was." And I think it applies here. I think there's endless amounts of data and analytical tools and technology that you can bring in. Talent, on the other hand, is a little more challenging. There's a huge rush on talent in this space. But generally speaking, the opportunities are almost limitless, depending on how much money you have. But I think what's more important on those types of decisions is, what questions do you really want to answer? And what are you going to do with that information? Because I think there's a real tendency here. When I started in industry 20 plus years ago, this wasn't much of an option. There were chart reviews and some work, registries and investigator-initiated studies, but not anything like today. And every study you did cost a lot of money. They were clinical trials, and so you did them sparingly. Nowadays, you can crank out a study in a few days and generate some insights and try to figure out what to do with that information. But the issue is, where does it take you? Like, what decisions can you make off that information? And I think that's where we can get hung up as organizations, is doing a lot of analyses without actually doing anything with the results.
Agree. That's true. You can analyze, but you get paralyzed at the end of it if you haven't been able to do anything. I want to go back to some of the stuff that you talked about, the equivalence between randomized control trials and RWE. And you talked about the fact that sometimes the equivalence or the matching between the two of them is dependent on the context. And could you shed a little more light on that in terms of what kind of areas do you think will kind of see the fruits of that kind of effort first?
Yeah, I think so. When we try to emulate an RCT with real-world evidence, first of all, it stands to reason the drug has to be out in the marketplace. It has to be being used for the patients that you want to do the test in. And so the measurements that are used in the randomized control trial, you need to be able to capture those in real-world data. Now, if it was a measurement that was very specific for that controlled trial, like actigraphy or some EEG measures that aren't routinely done in collected in real-world data, you're not going to be able to have the right kind of data to build an emulation model to compare whether you can reproduce an RCT using real-world evidence. And that's one of the fundamental challenges. In clinical trials, we sometimes use very specialized endpoints that aren't collected in routine care. So reproducing them, therefore, is nearly impossible. But there are cases where we use endpoints in clinical trials that are captured in medical records or in claims data. And then it makes it much more likely that you can replicate, provided you can also capture the precision of that patient population, that you have the right details of the demographics of the individuals, comorbidities, their co-medications, all the factors that matter to do proper matching.
So do you anticipate, therefore, that one could actually move towards a scenario where at least the control arm, the placebo arm, could possibly be done in silico, whereas the actual trial administration of the drug in question could be done physically using traditional methods?
I think I think it's actually what came out in this report that was interesting. Placebo is actually harder to match than comparator drug, because for patients with a particular condition, they're more likely to be treated with some other drug than not on any drug, if you truly want to match those patients, if they're getting the same kind of standard of care, right? So you're in a health system where everybody's getting a proper standard of care, and you're comparing a drug to another drug, you're more likely to find that information versus placebo. I think for things like external control arms, a lot of times historical or matching clinical trial data can be used. Companies like Acorn AI have built a business out of this. So, but that's not necessarily real world data. That's clinical trial data repurposed for external control arm use.
Got it. And based on your experience, how are the regulators looking at this? I mean, is there huge appetite to kind of look at this seriously, or is there some degree of skepticism? How do you see that playing out?
I think the regulators have been very open about this field. And in my experience, they encourage companies to submit ideas on how to leverage real world data and real world evidence in submissions. And there's more and more of it with control arms or with supportive information. I think the actual approvals of new molecular entities or new indications, it's a pretty high bar. And that's why we're seeing it mostly limited to conditions where it's really difficult or impossible to randomize. And that's why it's often rare diseases or situations where you really can't randomize.
One last question before we actually have to sign off, but that's a little bit more on in the weeds. You talked about, obviously, one of the challenges, especially as a data scientist, so much depends on the quality of the data, the adequacy of the data, and the data being organized correctly. So how much of the effort actually goes into the whole data wrangling, and then also making sure that the integration of data will require more open APIs. And so, is that going to present a regulatory challenge and stuff like that? How much of that are you finding you have to grapple with on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, the data engineering time, it's known that that's the majority of the time we spend. Probably 70 or 80% of the time is to spend cleaning data. But, there's a lot of smart companies out there that have realized there's a business to be made out of that. So there are opportunities to work with companies that are providing, better and better curated data for us to utilize. So I think, this is an area where, again, we're going to accelerate. Machine learning will be helpful in many cases, and artificial intelligence will have algorithms to do this for us in the future. So it gets back to this theme of we're just going to be going faster and faster. More and more insights and evidence are going to be generated, but how do you actually make it stick, right? Like, what are you going to use it for? Who's going to listen? And how do you get HCPs to pay attention to messages that we generate from information that we're creating?
And actually, one other question related to that. When you think about data privacy, especially in terms of, let's say, the privacy norms that you may have in the United States as opposed to GDPR, et cetera, are those challenges likely to kind of disappear with the approaches that are being taken, that there is going to be adequate protection? How will you give comfort to society in general that you are basically preserving the data and not, misusing it in some way?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think access to data will last only as long as we have the public's trust.
Exactly.
So fortunately, there are companies, as I mentioned, working on federated learning models where data is protected. And we can do analytics and build algorithms without ever even handling the identified data. So I think there are ways that we can still grow access to data around the world in countries where today we have little access to data. and we can't really understand natural history of disease in certain populations. I think that will improve. You know, the opportunity to expand this outside of you know, the U.S. and Europe and many countries around, too many countries around the world, is underway as we speak.
Wonderful. Troy, we could go on and on, I'm pretty sure, but we are out of time, and I'm sure my audience is as fascinated by everything that you've told us. I think you've given us a glimpse into the future. It's been really fascinating, and so I want to thank you very much for taking the time and kind of talking to us this afternoon, this evening, this morning, wherever the people are. But nevertheless, thanks so much for participating. And thank you to the audience. Thanks so much for being here. We look forward to seeing you again on the Indegene Digital Summit tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay.